Hi, my name is Paul Prettitore. I'm a senior land administration specialist at the World Bank, where, among other things, I've been working on a global study on land conflict and inclusion. I have to disclose I am a lawyer. I'm not an economist, so I hope you will excuse my use of any incorrect economic terminology. But I did team up with some colleagues who are economists for this work. Um, so our global study on land conflict and inclusion was looking at the big question of what is the impact of conflict on land and inclusion. And how we looked at this was to see how different factors of conflict impacted security of land tenure and what this meant for subsequent inclusion or exclusion. Um, and land tenure it's not static, it's kind of forever moving. So you can have strong land tenure, you can have weak land tenure across the spectrum, and different events can shift the needle between strong and weak. And we wanted to see how conflict was shifting that needle, particularly for vulnerable types of persons. One of the problems we initially experienced was that there's a real lack of data on this type of information. And this is why we teamed up with Prindex, who has a global data set on perceptions of land tenure. And why perceptions of land tenure are important? Well, if you think your land is insecure, it's probably a good indication that it is insecure. And even if it's not, it sends a message to government and policymakers that there is a problem. How we did this is we looked at the impact of organized violence on perceptions of tenure security. So what we used the information from data from Uppsala conflict data program, the georeferenced event data set, to measure organized violence by basically looking at organized violence by actors against other actors or civilians that resulted in at least one death in a specific location on a specific date. And we matched that up with Prindex data about perceptions of tenure security, looking primarily at organized violence that happened within 1 year of the Prindex household survey being administered. So what were the headline findings for us? I would say, there were 4 key findings among many other interesting findings. So the first was that organized violence was negatively correlated with perceived tenure security for all 3 types of tenure that were being measured by Prindex. So that included people that declared themselves owners of property, tenants of property, or people that were living with family who owned the property. The most negatively affected were tenants. Their security seemed the weakest and seemed to be weakened even more by conflict. Urban landowners were also relatively negatively impacted. And one of the interesting findings was that when you disaggregated the data by gender, you didn't really come up with any differences. So I think that that's something that needs to be explored a bit in kind of the next phase of this research. The other headline finding was that the effect of organized violence makes the effect of income on perceived tenure security weaker. So it reduced the positive effect of high income and makes less negative the effect of low income on perceptions of tenure security. Lower income people tended to start it out at the weakest level of tenure security. Highest income people started at the highest level of tenure security, maybe not surprising. But what we saw was that conflict was in a way a bit of a leveler. So while tenure security, perceptions of tenure security weakened for all income categories, the biggest drop was for high income. So in a way, it's almost like conflict is a bit of a leveler when it comes to perceptions of tenure security. And I think that there's probably a number of reasons for that, but one of them being that low-income people probably live constantly with events that cause tenure insecurity. So conflict might just be one more that they deal with, whereas higher income households are much less used to these type of conflict shocks. So one of the other findings was that the measures of severity, so if you looked at the number of deaths or violent events, it didn't provide more insights into the relationship between perceptions of tenure security and organized violence than the binary measures of violence or non-violence. And finally, organized violence affected perceptions of tenure security within the general population for as long as 28 years. And these effects were comparable to the effects of lower education or low income sufficiency. So we did find that organized violence did have long-term effects that were quite considerable. Now, why are these findings important? For a couple of reasons. So the first is that it gives us a better understanding of the impacts of organized violence on tenure security. We know that in general, tenure security weakens in situations of fragility and conflict and violence, but understanding how exactly this happens, how people's rights and perceptions are effective, gives us a better idea of how to develop interventions later on. So that's another reason that the findings are really important. If we know what type of households are affected, how tenants versus owners, urban versus rural, whether there's a fear of expropriation or intra-family violence, these help us target policy and other types of interventions during the conflict period to prevent tenure security from weakening, and in the post-conflict situation where we can hopefully introduce some measures that would enhance tenure security. The next phase, I mean, this research answered a lot of questions for us. It also raised even more new questions. So in terms of where this would lead us, I think kind of the next round of research, we would try to target the impacts of long-term organized violence versus shorter term. Because we know that, at least in discussions with affected communities, memory can be quite long, and people can remember an organized violence event that happened, sometimes to their grandparents or their parents, and this can affect the tenure security if another event happens. The other is that the types of perceptions that are affected by organized violence. So digging a bit more down on a granular level to see if organized violence causes more fears of state expropriation, or expropriation by armed actors, or expropriation by the private sector to invest, or whether it increases risk of intra-family violence, or increases fears of evictions, particularly for urban tenants. And then finally, it would be interesting to look at the spatial spillover effects of organized violence. So looking at neighboring communities that aren't necessarily experiencing organized violence themselves, but see if there is some spillover effects on perceptions from neighboring areas that are subjected to organized violence. So that's it. I hope you find this research interesting, and I would be very much interested if the viewers wanted to follow up with me and send any questions, advice, or feedback. That would be great. Thanks very much.